Continuing on with the Rolling Stone theme, again, the third time here, we celebrate one more hero of geology. This is Harry Hammond Hess. Harry Hammond Hess was at Princeton University, but before that, he was actually a military man. He was in World War II. He was in the Navy, and as part of the Navy, part of his duties in the Navy, he was actually mapping the seafloor with sonar. It was a new technique at the time. They were looking, of course, for submarines, but they also found that you could actually see the features of the seafloor with the sonar, with side scan sonar. Today is what we use, or multi-beam sonar. So we're going to ask some questions today. It's Harry Hess who put the model about how we understand how the Earth works. He put it all together. And so that's really important. Harry Hess gave us our understanding of plate tectonics. He didn't call it plate tectonics, but he understood how it all fit together in this puzzle. And so we're going to talk a little bit about ocean basins and plate tectonics. And then we're also going to talk about the structure of the Earth. What is the structure of the Earth and how does the Earth work? And so what are examples of plate tectonics? And so that's the last part of this talk. Relatively short as far as the number of slides go in this talk, but I may wax on a little bit with some of my play-by-play narrative that goes along with this. As you guys realize, the Earth has four noble truths. The Earth is very old. This is part 2. The Earth is very dynamic as well. And so we're going to get to the other parts later on in this semester, but we're going to talk about the dynamic Earth today. And as you know, the Earth is the study of Earth and all the planetary bodies. And if we just want to go through the facts now, we talk about Earth. Earth is a layered planetary body. So we have layers in the Earth, and from top to bottom, we're going to discuss these. So the very top, the outer surface of the Earth is called the crust. Below the crust is a part of the mantle. We call it the subcrustal upper mantle. So the subcrustal upper mantle is the second layer of Earth, if you will. Now, sometimes you can divide the crust into upper crust and lower crust, but in fact, the scum, or the subcrustal upper mantle, that's the acronym we use. S for sub, C for crustal, U for upper, and M for mantle. Scum is the layer that's just below the crust. After that, there's a zone of partial melting. Now, I don't mention it here in this list, but below the scum and above the asthenosphere, that's what they call that, the asthenosphere, there is a zone of partial melting, and that is what the plates actually glide around on. So it's a little bit of a slippery surface in which the Earth's plates can actually move around the surface of the Earth. And so the crust and the scum go together to make what we call tectonic plates. So the plates themselves are made out of crust plus the subcrustal upper mantle. And below that, a zone of partial melting. Below that, what we call the asthenosphere. The asthenosphere goes from about 250 to about 600 kilometers deep inside of the Earth. Below the asthenosphere is a zone that we call the lower mantle. And then even as a part of that lower mantle, there's a zone called the D double prime layer. The D double prime layer is also regarded as the graveyard of subducted slabs. So if you take a tectonic plate and subduct it into the mantle, it's going to go all the way to the bottom of the mantle, essentially, and then get reheated at some point down there. So the lower mantle, and then below the lower mantle, we have the outer core, and then we have the inner core. We're going to talk about the components of each one of those. The crust itself differs between oceans and continents. Ocean crust is very, very thin. It is very, very dense at 3.0 grams per cc. Continental crust, more closely, is about 2.7 grams per cc. So if you compare the densities of those two, the continental crust will actually float when it hits and actually overtake the ocean crust, if you will. So it'll float on top of ocean crust. And both of those are actually lighter than what the mantle is. The mantle is actually about 3.3 grams per cc. And so 3.0 and 2.7 can float on the 3.3, which is the upper mantle, in fact. So the upper mantle, 3.3 grams per cc. So if we think about the Earth as being composed of layers of various densities, that causes these upper layers to actually float on the lower layers. And if you get even farther into the mantle, it gets higher and higher density, somewhere around 7 or 8 grams per cc by the time you get to the bottom of the mantle. Actually, I think it's 6.6 maybe when you get to the bottom of the mantle. And then when you get to the core, we're actually talking about metallic substances, right? So liquid metal, okay, so that's up around 10 or 12 grams per cc. I think it's 10 grams per cc when you get to the core. And so the outer core and the inner core are really, really dense materials. So tectonic plates that are composed of the crust and the subcrustal upper mantle glide around on the surface of the Earth. They've done that for the last 300, about 1,500 million years or so. Ever since the Proterozoic, at least, they've been working their magic around the surface of the Earth, giving us various supercontinents and breaking apart through time through excess heat. The heat will actually break these supercontinents apart. So we have crusts of different types. In the ocean crust, it's usually basaltic crust. In the continent, it's usually something akin to a granitic crust. And so 3.0 is roughly the density of basalts in the ocean. Yeah, if you look at like Hawaii, it's going to be that dark, dense black rock that is basalt. In the continents with granite, it's that sort of pink rock, if you will, and that pink rock is slightly lighter at 2.7 grams per cc. So that's mostly what the composition of the crust is. When we talk about sedimentary rocks, we're just talking about the icing on the cake then, okay? That's the stuff that's at the very, very top of the crust. And so it doesn't go very deep, in fact. So it gets maybe 40 kilometers deep at the very most, the deepest basins that we know of. With the crust and the scum, they compose the lithosphere that's on this list here. The tectonic plates move around, and when they collide, they form mountain ranges. When they split apart, they form rift zones. You're going to see that here. What drives these things? What drives that motion? What breaks them apart? Well, it's mostly that heat, but then also there's the activity of the mantle itself. And you have to think about the mantle. It's actually a solid, but it's a solid that can actually move almost like a fluid, but it is more aptly described as a ductile material. In other words, it's like a solid that can actually flow. And if you're familiar at all with like glacial ice and things like that, you'll know that glacial ice can actually flow as well. In this case, we're actually talking about rock, however. So in the subcrustal upper mantle and down below that in the upper mantle and the lower mantle, we're talking about rock that actually can flow. And so the way that it flows is something like a pot of water over a stove. It'll actually form mantle convection cells, and those convection cells rise and fall. And so they go all the way down to the core mantle boundary, heat up at that liquid interface at the core mantle boundary. That D-doubled prime layer actually heats up. And so this material that may get superheated and come back up to the surface of the Earth, we call those things plumes. So not only do you get the mantle convection cells, you may get blobs of material that may rise up in the mantle as well. We call those plumes, and the plumes can actually pool up underneath of the tectonic plates. And when they pool up under the tectonic plates, they may actually emit volcanoes and pierce through the plates above, and we call those things hotspots. And so we're going to look at hotspots. We're going to look at where we subduct plates, that is, where two plates collide. One of them is going to take a dive, and then we're also going to look at where plates actually originate sometimes, and that is in these rift zones, and then also where they are not just being pulled apart like that, they get new crustal material. So our ocean basins are actually being perpetually and continuously recycled, whereas the continents are not. The continents tend to ride high and dry over the rest of the world, essentially, and so the oceans themselves take up most of the actual motion on these outer plates as they collide and pull apart and break apart. So when we describe these sorts of motions, when we describe the sort of behaviors in between these plates, we talk about divergence. Divergence means that things pull apart or they're going in opposite directions. When they converge and when they collide with one another, that's what we call convergence. And so convergence, and then sometimes the plates will actually slip side by side, and we call that transform plate boundaries. And so those are the main types right there. So Who came up with this idea? Okay, more than Harry Hess. It actually started earlier than that, as early as 1919. Alfred Wegener was a German meteorologist. Meteorologists are people who study weather, okay? So here's a meteorologist who says, I think I know how the Earth works. And he wrote about it. And he probably was mostly correct. He was wrong in a few aspects. But in 1919, we had just finished World War I. And nobody wanted to read the German literature in order to understand plate tectonics or anything like that. It wasn't even known at the time, right? Well, how do we explain how the continents seem to fit together? That was a big mystery back then. And that mystery would include all the way back to the 1500s when the earliest map makers, so when people first began to set sail and explore the world around them, they set out in sailing ships. And when they set out in sailing ships, they very carefully marked where the coastlines were. And it was a guy named Ortelius back in the 1500s, I think it was 1520s. He was a Dutchman who was making charts for the Spanish. And so Holland was a colony of Spain at that time. And so he was a chart maker, Ortelius, and Ortelius would look at South America and Africa in the charts, and he said, wow, looks like they fit together. And of course, he was right all the way back then, but he didn't have a good explanation about why they would fit together because nobody believed that those continents were actually together. Even the earliest biologists, they tried to figure out ways. How can you disperse animals from one continent to another, or trees even more so, from one continent to another? And it was Alfred Wegener who first came up with an idea about how to do that. He called his idea, in fact, he called it Continental Drift, that the continents would actually drift across the Earth's surface. And they kind of do that in a way, but he didn't have a good explanation about why they would drift. And so Alfred Wegener said those continents just plow through the oceans and wind up being in place where they are. He recognized, in fact, a supercontinent all the way back then that was called Gondwana. Gondwana means the land of the Gonds, if you will. And it was based in Africa, so Africa was kind of the keystone continent at that time. South America fit against it. Madagascar, that little island off the side, fit into Africa as well. And then also you could fit Antarctica and you could fit Australia into that supercontinent called Gondwana. It was the great southern continent. And it was Alfred Wegener that realized from reading the literature, it's like, well, there are the same reptiles that live on each one of those continents. They find the fossil remains on each one of those continents. Things like Lystrosaurus, things like Sinosaurus. These are animals. They were reptiles, but they're animals still, and they left their fossil record in each one of the southern continents. When he looked at this, he says, how do you explain the distribution? These are not swimming reptiles. These were reptiles that were on dry land. How do you explain that distribution? Then he also recognized that there's a plant called Glossopteros. And Glossopteros was like, a tree, essentially. And so that tree, living in the end of the Permian, left fossils behind as well. It left impressions of leaves and things like that. Well, how do you explain why you see a tree in one continent as another? You'd have to drift across the oceans and they weren't like coconuts, which can drift around the world, and kind of land on a seashore and then set up shop there and then grow there, right? The Glossopteros wasn't able to do that. And so how do you disperse these plants? How do you disperse the animals? And then one other thing he recognized is like sometimes the mountains seem to end at the end of a continent and then show up again on another continent. For instance, in Africa, they have something called the Trans-Africa orogeny. And so it's found in Antarctica. It's also found in southern South Africa. So how do you explain this sort of like unusual distribution for mountain ranges? And with that, he gave us this idea. He says, I think continental drift may be the way that this works. And the way that works, he says, if the Earth is like spinning like a top, and if you leave a top spinning with some untethered weights on it, those weights will actually spread out. And he says Gondwana must have broken up from the centrifugal force that was applied to those continents. And so that was enough to cause these continents to spin and then spread out and plow through the oceans around them. He was wrong. but he was right that they were once together. So that's the difference between right and actually being shown that's like that can't be the way that it works. Of course, he was a meteorologist. He didn't know any better. He had this defunct idea. So it is a defunct idea, but he certainly was on the right track. Okay, fast forward. In 1919, he proposed this idea of continental drift. In 1921, he republished the same paper. In 1925, he republished the same paper. In 1927, an American named Taylor comes along and he says, you know, there's something to this. I don't know exactly what it is, but I recognize things even in North America that seem to put us together with the rest of the continents as well. So Taylor began to question, you know, what is this thing? How does the Earth work? Sadly, after Wegener had published his ideas on continental drift, he was on an expedition to Greenland, and in Greenland he actually had a heart attack, and so he was skiing along, and it was just too much stress for him, I guess, and he died. He checked out there. I don't think that they ever found his body, so he's still in Greenland somewhere, and so he was on an expedition there. So that is the story of Alfred Wegener and continental drift. Now, continental drift is not what we call this sort of idea anymore. We have a modified version of this. But if you look at this diagram, this is actually what he calls in the young Carboniferous, the Eocene, and then also he's got all of these various continents in various positions. He reconstructed that based on the fossil content and so forth, and he's pretty close to accurate, actually. So if you take one supercontinent, today we call that Pangaea. It's the sum of all continents clustered together in one supercontinent. He gave us that idea. So you start at the top up here, centrifugal force, in his opinion anyway, was what caused these continents to then drift across the face of the Earth. That's the idea of continental drift there summed up. So now let's talk a little bit about the interior of the Earth, and we're going to come back to how it works. Here's some depths to add to the list of different parts of the Earth as we know it. So the crust is somewhere between 0 and 80 kilometers thick. The subcrustal upper mantle about down to 200 kilometers in thickness, and somewhere below 200 kilometers in that zone of partial melting, and then below that even is that upper mantle, and that's 600 kilometers. You know, most of the textbooks provide a cutaway diagram of what it would look like inside of the Earth, and most of them show the mantle as this glowing orange red sort of color, and in fact it's not. The interior of the Earth, in fact, should be green by all accounts. It's actually made out of the mineral olivine, and so olivine is an olive color. And I've tried to illustrate this myself. I actually did this diagram of a cutaway of the Earth because I wasn't satisfied with what other folks had done as a cutaway for what the Earth should look like on the interior. So in other words, it's green on the inside until you finally get down to that outer core, which was liquid molten metal. And so I left that sort of orange glowing color, if you will. And then the solid interior inner core is actually iron nickel. Okay, so that is the innermost part of the Earth. And it's actually divided into two parts as well. There's an inner core and an outer inner core. But the outer core is molten. And so the molten outer core surrounds that inner core, which is under enormous amounts of pressure, and the differential spin between those two layers gives us our magnetic field today. I give the depths on here. I'm not going to ask you, what is the depth of this layer or that layer, but just know that most of the Earth is composed of mantle. So the mantle is composed mostly of olivine. And the crustal material, well, it can either be basaltic material like in the oceans, or it could be granitic material like in the continents. And they interact with one another. And so that subcrustal upper mantle together with the crust, that's the outermost part of the Earth. So down to about 200 kilometers, right? So in the next slide, you can actually see this is the textbook version of what people think is going on inside of the Earth. And that's these mantle convection cells that I was talking about. How do you distribute the heat from something that is superheated at the edge of the outer core? We call it the core mantle boundary. How do you distribute that heat? Well, it kind of boils, essentially. When it boils like that, you pull the rocks apart at the very top surface up there in that convection cell. One plate goes one way, another plate goes another, because they come up and divide and pulls it apart like that. On the other sides of the plate, that's where you get collisions. And so if you have ocean plate up against a continent, the ocean plate will take a dive underneath of that continent because it's heavier, for one thing. And then it takes a dive, but where does it go after that? That's a good question. In here, they just show it ending right there. They don't. That's not molten material, however. That is actually solid material. It just happens to have a plastic consistency or ductile consistency. So it is not exactly liquid. It is a solid that flows. Mantle convection cells. So you can see the asthenosphere is that upper part of the mantle, that just at the very top of that, the plates would actually slide across in that, on that zone of partial melting up there. Okay, what's a better example of how these things work? This may be closer to reality. We don't know for sure. But in this diagram, it's a little bit more complex, and you can see that. You can see that D double prime layer down there at the core mantle boundary, in fact, and so you're actually separating some of that material that gets superheated. It's sending it up in a mantle plume, and that mantle plume at times may make its way all the way up to the top of the mantle, where it then pools up and forms these things we call hot spots today. So hot spots can make it all the way up from the core mantle boundary. And the mantle convection cells themselves seem to be divided into two parts, an upper convection cell layer and then a deeper convection that is much below that. Anyway, you have to distribute heat, superheated at the bottom, cooler at the top. And so these things actually make these cycles like this, the mantle convection cells. In modern ovens, they have what they call convection oven. And in convection ovens, they actually have the air heated and it circulates, and things cook faster that way, but it distributes the heat. That's the reason for doing that. In this diagram also, you can actually see where there's a mid-ocean ridge, and they're showing mantle convection cells on either side of that mantle ridge. That's MOR, the abbreviation MOR. To the right of an area called a subduction zone. Well, you can see an ocean plate taking a dive there. You can also see the plates actually beginning to break up and turn into blobs. They do get heated when they get deeper and deeper into the mantle, but they may wind up at the core mantle boundary, where they then get reconstituted and come back up as material in these mantle plumes. So the mantle plumes themselves look a little bit like mushrooms on here. So you can see mushroom 1, mushroom number 2, and mushroom number 3, where it's differentiated, and part of it actually makes it up to just below the surface of the plates. Okay, so the plates at the very top up there. Core mantle boundary circulation is one of the least understood processes in our knowledge of geology, in fact, because we can't get down there, right? So there's no way to get down inside of the earth to be able to see what's going on there. We have to do it all through indirect means. And there's actually 4 different ways that we can do that. We can do it through meteorites. It's a long story, but in fact, the meteorites tell us about the interior of another planet that would have formed roughly about the same time as Earth. It had a core, it had a mantle. And so together, it had even a core mantle boundary that we recognize in some meteorites. That's indirect evidence, though. The other thing that we do is we can collect sound waves, and we can actually look at the structure of the Earth from a seismic perspective. You know, we have earthquakes around the world. Those earthquakes generate sound waves, essentially. Those sound waves penetrate through the Earth, at least most of the Earth. And when it gets to the opposite side, we can actually record that with seismograms. Seismographs are the instrument. Seismograms are the actual record that they record. So if we look at the indirect evidence, those are 2 lines of the evidence. A third line of the evidence is we can actually do experiments on high pressure experiments on materials to find out what the composition is. And then we also get tiny bits of mantle sometimes ejected from volcanoes. And so when it gets ejected from a volcano, you may have a chunk of mantle in that material. It only happens a few places around the world, but we understand what's in the mantle based on these chunks that come up with some volcanic eruptions. Okay. Where did plate tectonics come from? If we are standing right now on the shoulders of giants with continental drift, let's talk about plate tectonics, and it's Harry Hammond Hess who gave us this idea. He said, if we have new crustal material forming at these mid-ocean ridges, that's like running right down through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There's a mid-ocean ridge there. And right through the middle of that ridge, there is a place in the middle that is a rift valley. It's below the sea, mind you, but it's a rift valley. And for all of our measurements and all of our techniques, and looking at even the magnetic signatures of the rocks on the sea floor, we can tell that that ridge is actually being pulled apart. And as it pulls apart, or it pushes apart is the other alternative, when you open up new material like that, new crustal material forms right there at the mid-ocean ridges. That's happening today, actually, in a place like Iceland. Iceland is one of these places that's right astraddle that mid-ocean ridge in the Atlantic, and it's actually producing new material there. Well, these ridges go all the way around the world. They're 40,000 kilometers long, so we have one that continues from the South Atlantic, and then it splits. One side goes over to the Indian Ocean, the other side goes over to the East Pacific Rise, they call it, just offshore. Maybe 500 kilometers, maybe 1,000 kilometers, 1,500 kilometers offshore from South America. The East Pacific rises in that area, and it is a spreading center as well. That's what they call these things. They call them spreading centers. It's a divergent plate boundary where new crustal material is being added in the middle here. So you pull it apart, you add new material there. So the East Pacific rise in the Indian Ocean, they have one of these, and also in the Mid-Atlantic Ocean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Harry Hess said new material is being added there. That ocean goes all the way over to the sides of continents, and if it collides with the continent, like in the Caribbean, in the eastern part of the Caribbean plate, there is the plate here, and then there's the Atlantic Ocean over here, and it's being subducted underneath of the Caribbean plate. And so in that case, that is a convergent plate boundary. They're heading towards one another, and one of them takes a dive. That process is called subduction. And so sometimes you scrape off a little bit, and that's called abduction, okay? So you can have abduction in places like Trinidad. There's a little bit of an abducted plate there, but most of it gets subducted, and once it gets subducted, it breaks apart inside the mantle and may make its way all the way down to the core mantle boundary where it gets reheated and recycled, essentially. So that process is all due to Harry Hess's putting it all together. He put it together in his mind, right? So it was a puzzle for him. It's like, I think this is the way it works. He had already done sonar over things like the deep trenches, and he realized that the trenches were very, very special. But why is a trench there? Well, it's because there's subduction going on there. He gave us an explanation for that feature. And he realized then also that spreading centers like the East Pacific Rise and the Mid-Ocean Ridge, those are all related, in fact, to new material being added. So that spreading center as well. He put the puzzle together. So Harry Hess is responsible for the idea of plate tectonics. The guy on the right-hand side, his name is John Tuslow Wilson. He's a Canadian. And he said, "Oh, this is brilliant, because not only has Harry solved the puzzle about how the Earth works, I now know why we have these supercontinents that are like this." He recognized that, well, even Wegener noticed that the continents were all together, whether it was Gondwana or whether it was something that later became known as Pangaea. And so Pangaea was all the continents together. And it was Wilson, John Tuslow Wilson, he said, I got it. The continents were all together and they break apart because of these spreading centers. And so the spreading centers give us rift zones, pulls the continents apart. They collide when they come together. They break apart when they pull apart. He came up with something known as the Wilson cycle. So the Wilson cycle is one of the fundamental concepts in plate tectonics. And so the Wilson cycle says we have cycles of supercontinents, and then these supercontinents break apart. The last time we had a supercontinent was during the Mesozoic. We called it Pangaea. But there have been supercontinents before that, in fact. And so there was one that broke apart right before this great flowering of life that happened on Earth, and that was called Rodinia. So this earlier supercontinent called Rodinia broke apart in Precambrian time, about 760 million years ago, prior to the Cambrian explosion. So we call the Cambrian explosion this great flowering of multicellular animals across the face of the Earth, and they happened on every continent, right, in the continental shelves. So J. Tuzlaw Wilson came up with this idea of supercontinent formation and then breaking apart. First of all, they come together in collisions, and then they break apart with a rift. After that rifting, they begin to drift apart from one another. And as they drift apart, eventually they're going to converge with another continent of some sort, and eventually they're going to collide again. So that takes us through the 4 steps. Rift, drift, converge, collide. Rift, drift, converge, collide. Okay, one more time. They rift first. Supercontinents will rift. Then they drift. And then they converge with other small continental pieces. And then they collide. And then in that collision, you may get one continent and then another continent. So today, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the continents beginning to, not just after this sort of rifting event that occurred during the Mesozoic, we're actually bringing everything back together again in places like in Asia, in Europe, in Africa. Africa is colliding with Europe. Asia, South Asia has collided with the rest of Asia, and it's resulted in some unusual plate tectonics. We're going to look at that in some detail here. First, we're going to look at the hotspots. So the hotspots are these mantle plumes. They pull up material below the surface. This actually is molten material in this case. It's one of the exceptions. So that plume will come up to the surface when it gets closer and closer to the surface. There's less confining pressure on it when it gets there and pools underneath of these tectonic plates. It begins to find paths of weakness, and they actually form magma. And so that magma is the molten rock that would then pool up under places like in Hawaii. Well, if you look at Hawaii today, it has very active volcanism, right? So Mauna Loa is the main source for magmas, but in fact, Kilauea is the active volcanic activity today is mostly in Kilauea. And then, of course, there are rift zones along the edges, and so it's breaking apart in places because that magma has kind of poked through in those spots. And so the islands today are there because of the volcanic origin and because of the hotspot that's down below it. If you trace the track of that hotspot, and you can do this in Google Earth, all you got to do is look at Google Earth, and you can actually trace where the Hawaiian Islands are, and you'll follow them up to where they make a dog leg to the right, and then you can follow them in a series of what we call seamounts. And so those emperor seamounts, they go all the way up, well, to the Aleutian Islands and to the Kamchatka Peninsula. That's where they have collided. At one point, that's where the hotspot used to be, but the plate has moved over the top. The hotspot, relatively stationary, and the plate over the top, moving. As though you had a plate of tin metal over the top of a torch, and it would heat up different places along that sheet, if you will. And so that's what you see here. About 43 million years ago, there was a shift in the direction of the plate there in the Pacific plate. So that's the story about the Hawaiian hotspot. That's the story about volcanoes in Hawaii. And it's also about the former places where the hotspot used to be, where these seamounts are preserved today. On tops of those seamounts, many of them are flat-topped, and many of them actually had growths of coral and algae and corals and all sorts of animal life and plant life. And so in the deep seas, in fact, so not really deep, some of it, when you get out until you get into the North Pacific, they get pretty deep then. The Hawaiian Islands are breaking apart, not just from the volcanism that's going on there. It's not just causing the rift zones around the edges. Eventually, these things actually tend to split, and you get submarine landslides associated with them as well. But we're not going to talk about that today. That's a different topic for geology, but this is the story about the Hawaiian hotspot right here. We're going to go to another hotspot now, and that's in the central Atlantic here. And we've already talked about this, but there's that rift zone that runs down the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In this case, on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is that Iceland hotspot as well. So many of the hotspots actually are located on tectonic features that have other sorts of names. This is a divergent plate boundary. And divergent meaning that they're heading in opposite directions. That's what the arrows indicate here. So if you go on the left-hand side, that's the North American plate. If you go on the right-hand side, that's the Eurasian plate, or that's the African plate. And you can see how Pangaea once fit together there, and it's breaking apart ever since the Mesozoic here. South America down here, the same story. And in between those two, in fact, there is the Caribbean plate that's in between North America and South America there. and there's active subduction going on there. But as far as the spreading centers, that red line more or less traces the location for that spreading center, and the red dot shows you the location of the hotspot there. So that is the story of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and it's a high mountain chain. It's not the highest on Earth. Actually, the Hawaii hotspot is the highest mountain from base to top, but the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is actually pretty high as well, off of what would be the base of the seafloor, essentially. And so, yeah, it still makes, because the new material is relatively hot and relatively high and as it cools, it actually sinks, okay? So it makes a relatively high ridge that runs through the Mid-Atlantic here. When we go to other hotspots, one of the other widely accepted areas where there's a hotspot is where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden, which meets the East Africa Rift Zone. And we talked about rifting on the mid-ocean ridges. Well, East Africa is also rifting apart in a very complex manner. It's like one of these puzzles, right? So if you have a jigsaw puzzle and you're pulling that jigsaw puzzle apart, pieces get broken in funny ways, and that's the way that East Africa is being rifted apart now. It has different tracks in the East Africa Rift Zone. We call that the East Africa Rift Zone. It is a rift valley. It goes through Eritrea, it goes through Ethiopia, it goes through the Sudan, it goes through Kenya, it goes through Tanzania, and it goes all the way down to Botswana. But that is the location where there are spreading centers. There's a spreading center in the Red Sea, which is off to the upper part there that's heading to the northwest, and there's a spreading center that heads off into the Indian Ocean here as well, through the Gulf of Aden, and then there's rifting apart. So we're pulling Africa apart right now. Africa is being split apart, let me put it that way, and that's called a rift zone. So that rift zone is where new crustal material is being added. Given enough time, there's going to be a new ocean that will open up in East Africa. It's going to separate East Africa from the rest of Africa on the west side. And of course, Asia and the Arabian Plate are going to continue heading north, whereas the southern part of Africa may, in fact, go south. The northern part of Africa, however, is colliding with the plates that are available in the Mediterranean. And of course, there's a couple of subduction zones right around Italy in the Mediterranean, and the Alpine mountains are actually forming from that collision as well, even as we speak. So the next part of this is about the subduction zones. The subduction zones are where we recycle that material back into the mantle, and so you subduct it around this area. Today we call this the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire is synonymous with where we have a lot of volcanoes. Now on Earth today, there are roughly about 55 volcanoes that are erupting. 50 to 60 volcanoes constantly are erupting around the Earth. There are about 1,500 active volcanoes around the world, 1,500 volcanoes that tend to be in the last 1,000 years or so, they've been active. Okay, so that is how many volcanoes there are. Most of them are around this Ring of Fire. So that's places like Japan, the Philippines, Tonga, the volcanic eruption that occurred there earlier this semester. And then there are volcanoes in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, in a place called the Altiplano, and all the way up in Alaska. Alaska has a whole bunch of volcanoes going off as well, but mostly in the Aleutian Islands. And so the Aleutian Islands, very active volcanic area as well. And all related to this Ring of Fire, where we have ocean trenches forming because we have convergent plate boundaries going on, and we get subduction of ocean material below either continental or below another ocean plate. And so that's the Ring of Fire today. That's the subduction that's going on. When we talk about another type of subduction, that's actually type 1 subduction, where we take an ocean plate and take a dive. The other type of subduction is where we collide two continents together, and that's unusual. There are not too many places where that's happening today, but the Alps are one of those places, and then also all along the Himalaya into the Hindu Kush, and then all the way through Iran today, and places like that, and the Elbrus Mountains, if you're in the connection between Asia and Europe there. So all of the dark lines on here are places where you're converging. and having continents collide with one another. And so in the Saudi Arabian peninsula, it's colliding with Iran essentially. And when that occurs, you get a subduction there and you get deformation. You're forming mountain belts. So in Iran, they call those the Zagros Mountains, where India has drifted north and collided with the rest of Asia. You get the Himalaya, the highest mountains on Earth. It's a continental plate hitting a continental plate and forming the highest mountains on Earth and the highest plateau. That is, the Tibetan Plateau is associated with that collision as well. And when you collide those two, in fact, you're actually squeezing out material into Southeast Asia. It's called escape tectonics. When you have a collision zone like that and these things are crushing together, some of it squeezes out the side, like stepping on a tube of toothpaste. That material off to the side, that's called escape tectonics, and that's what's happening in Southeast Asia. Two continents colliding, that's what we call type 2 subduction. And it's not readily apparent what's going on there, but most people think that the Indian plate is actually taking a dive into the mantle as well. And so it's kind of detached from the rest of the Indian plate, and some of that material is actually being pulled into the mantle from that collision as well. When you get all the way up here into the upper left, you're actually looking at the Carpathian Alps there. So from the north of Greece all the way through the Balkans, you're looking at the Carpathian Alps. And then when you get farther over, you're in Italy and you're looking at the Apennine Mountains, and then the Alps themselves in Austria and Italy and places like that. You're getting collisional sort of tectonics as well. So those are places where we have type 2 subduction going on. And you get the high mountains. We're actually assembling a continent when we do that, right? So South Asia, the Indian part of South Asia used to be connected to Africa. It used to be connected to Australia. It used to be connected to Antarctica. And then lickety split, it's been traveling north and collides with Asia and just crushes. And it ruined an ocean basin that was once there. It was called Tethys. And so Tethys has almost disappeared except for its remnants today, which are inclusive of the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea is a remnant of that Tethyan. So the whole thing is kind of closed like this because India has collided with Asia, kind of like a Pac-Man, if you will. So that is plate tectonics in kind of a nutshell. To reiterate, we also have some places where there seems to be side-by-side motion where you don't have convergence or you don't have spreading centers. The other version is where the plates go side by side. That's what's happening in California today. In fact, that's the San Andreas Fault. It's also the northern part of Turkey where you get the northern Anatolian Fault that's acting in the same way. The plates are simply sliding side by side with one another. In South Mexico, you actually have volcanoes and convergence down there, but when you get into the northern part of Mexico, through the Gulf of Cortez, all the way into California, and then heading west, once you get to the Cape Mendocino area, that's all transform plate boundary, and you have side-by-side motion. Not so much with volcanoes, but in fact what you get are a lot of earthquakes because it's this side-by-side motion. So the San Andreas Fault, one of the most active fault zones on Earth, and you get this shearing. Shearing is this idea that things go side by side. You know, shears actually slice paper because they go side by side, right? So shearing is this motion that goes side by side. So that's what you get in plate tectonics. You get to have this because today we now accept Geology 115 as a prerequisite for getting into Geology 120, which is a lab course which can put you in a track. So if you really like geology, you can actually get into geology through this course as a gateway course. We just made that change recently here. But this is why I have to go through plate tectonics with you, even though this is called Life of the Past. You have to know how the continents have moved around in order to understand the distribution of plants and animals across the surface of the world as well. So that is in a very brief circumstance here. I think I've gone 45 minutes or so. That's a pretty quick review of what plate tectonics is and some of the earlier ideas about continental drift and so forth, and the people who gave us those sort of ideas, Alfred Wegener and Harry Hess and J. Tuzlo Wilson and a few others that I may have mentioned along the way. But anyway, this is, in fact, in a nutshell, the idea of plate tectonics and why we get volcanoes in certain areas and why we have earthquakes in other areas and why we have spreading centers like in the Juan de Fuca plate. In this last image here, you can see it's a spreading center and there's subduction going on. That's the little triangles that are all along the black line there. So that's subduction going on there in the Pacific Northwest. What do you get there? You get volcanoes, right? It's the Cascade Mountains, right? So the Cascades are very active volcanically. Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, Mount Hood. And so all of these sort of volcanoes are related to taking some of that crustal material, recycling, bringing it back up in the form of a volcanic eruption. So to review, we have convergent plate boundaries, we have divergent plate boundaries, convergence coming together, divergent heading apart, and then transform plate boundaries. And then we also have these various layers of Earth as well. We have the crust, which you can divide that into continental crust or ocean crust. Then we have that subcrustal upper mantle below that, all the way down to about 200 kilometers deep. And the crust in the subcrustal upper mantle make the plates, and there's a zone of partial melting below that. And then below that, we have the asthenosphere, goes all the way down to 600 kilometers. Below the asthenosphere, we have the lower mantle, and the lower mantle goes all the way to the core mantle boundary, deep inside of the Earth. And so you can look up the values for that. I think it's 1,400 kilometers deep. And then beyond that, we have that liquid metal, really molten metal in the outer core, and then inside of that, the inner core, where it's under enormously amounts of high pressure. That's where you get a solid inner core. And that's pretty much it for looking at the structure of the Earth and looking at a brief introduction to plate tectonics. And again, thanks for your attention, and I'll get this posted just as quick as I can here. This will be one of the things that you'll get to see. I'm actually going to be gone on a film expedition for the rest of this week, and then early next week I'll be back, but then I have to go to Cincinnati to give a talk. Sorry to leave you like this, but I'm going to try to get as many of these things recorded before I leave, and I leave tomorrow afternoon. So here we go. That's number 5. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I will talk to you when I get back. You can always send me an email. I'll try to respond to the emails as quickly as I can. Also, for your benefit, I also posted a short on Sicker Point, so you can look at what we look at when we look at angular unconformities. It's actually a video of the angular unconformity at Sicker Point in Scotland. Yeah, thanks for your attention. Talk to you soon. Bye now.